Good afternoon. I welcome you to the Medical Center Hour. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities here at the School of Medicine. And our program brings you these Medical Center Hour programs every week now in the fall up until the 14th of November. Today we are pleased to open the Medical Center Hour's 41st season. The late 1960s brainchild of former medical school dean Dr. Tom Hunter and visiting ethicist Joseph Fletcher, this forum on medicine and society in 1971 went from being an occasional series to a week-in, week-out regular event for the medical school, the hospitals and clinics, and the university and community. We're very grateful for the School of Medicine's continued support for these 4 decades. And we're very, very grateful for you, our audience, for your presence, and importantly, for your vibrant contributions to the 20 programs we will bring you this year, 10 each semester. Please do remember that really these are your programs. Your voices and your views are just as vital as what our invited speakers have to say. We count on hearing from you, often, always in the closing minutes of the hour, but often throughout the hour. So welcome to all of you, and let our year begin. Our program today is titled Escaping the Melodrama of the Ethically Impossible, the U.S. Sexually Transmitted Diseases Studies in Guatemala. So we're starting this year with one of the more compelling, if deeply disturbing, medical research tales of our time. Who knew that the infamous unethical U.S. Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in Tuskegee, Alabama, had an offshore counterpart? Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. physicians did research in Guatemala on sexually transmitted infections with U.S. and Guatemalan government sanction and support. Unlike Tuskegee, the Guatemala studies involved actual inoculation of disease and the paying of sex workers to transmit disease. The research subjects were unsuspecting and unconsenting Guatemalan prisoners, soldiers, mental patients, and sex workers. Only some were treated if and when they became infected. How this research came to light within just the last decade is a fascinating tale in itself. We're fortunate to have with us distinguished medical historian Susan Reverby, who found the Guatemala study papers and photographs archived in the University of Pittsburgh Library. What do this research and the international investigative and diplomatic processes its rediscovery set in motion, what do these mean now with respect to the ethics of clinical research involving human participants, and especially research carried out with vulnerable populations and in a global arena? Well, this is all a big part of what we'll consider today. Susan Reverby is the Marion Butler McLean Professor in the History of Ideas and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Wellesley College. She's an impressive scholar who's had an impressive career, and you'll find a brief bio sketch in your handout. Her presentation is our annual Kenneth R. Crispell Memorial History Lecture, one part of our History of the Health Sciences lecture series. John Arras, Porterfield Professor of Biomedical Ethics and Professor of Philosophy and Public Health Sciences here at UVA, will speak briefly after Professor Reverby. He will offer his perspective as a member of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, the federal commission which investigated the Guatemala studies and in 2011 issued the report Ethically Impossible, STD Research in Guatemala from 1946-1948. We had help in bringing Susan Reverby to the university and this program to you, so I'd like to say a very big thank you to the History of the Health Sciences lecture series, the Institute for Practical Ethics and Public Life, and the Center for Global Health. And now, Professor Susan Reverby.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very, very much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. It's an honor to be back here at UVA. So I want to start by having you think a little bit about, I just had cataract surgery, so I'm in between glasses. The questions that we try to ask, and I want to start by reminding you that these questions often get asked in television shows and movies. So those of you who follow Grey's Anatomy may remember at the end of the last season, not this one, but the year before, they were involved in an Alzheimer's study in which the wife in the story basically breaks the bubble blinding in order to treat a friend of theirs. And the husband is completely flipped out in the end, they end the study, and they have this argument about who were they responsible for, and he kept saying, but it was Adele, and I should treat her. And it didn't really matter, and he says, but what about all those people we can't treat now in the future? So the issue of how we think about ethical behavior in clinical trials and in medical research is very much a part of sort of public consciousness, if you want to use TV shows as sort of a good model of kind of what gets talked about in the culture. So I want to remind you, for those of you, some of you in the audience I know for whom syphilis is an important word, but for many of us in the post-penicillin era, it kind of is something more of the past than the current period. And this is a useful crude mortality rate chart for both AIDS before the antiretrovirals. And as you can see in the mid-40s when penicillin comes in, the drop in crude mortality rates, to give you just a sense of it. So by the 20s and 30s, syphilis is considered a really, really important disease that needs to be discussed, but it's barely being talked about because you can't say it in public, including the fact that Thomas Perrin, the Surgeon General, was kicked off CBS radio in the 30s for promising to use the word syphilis in public. So there was a lot of concern by the mid-30s about whether the drugs, the heavy metals being used, were causing the symptoms rather than curing them. And after 43, when penicillin proves to be a cure for the early stages of the disease and latent stages of the disease by the 50s, there's real debates about what can happen with this disease and what we need to do to treat people. And one of the leading syphilologists at Johns Hopkins, Joseph Earl Moore, bemoans actually in the mid-50s his fear that the disease will go away with all of its secrets still unrevealed to science. So it's in this context of concern about medication and a belief that the disease is different in African Americans than in whites on the basis of very bad data. That a study that you, I'm sure, all know, and I'm just going to do this briefly, that's referred to primarily as the Tuskegee syphilis study, but my colleagues in Tuskegee call it the study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, which its official title was, that takes place in and around Tuskegee. And the study, of course, goes on for 40 years between 1932 and 1972. It involves 624 men, and these are some of the numbers that are on this. And the key thing to remember about why this is important in terms of the Guatemala story is, despite the rumors to the contrary, and this belief is everywhere from, I heard Tom Brokaw say it on national television, to people, the most uninformed people, is the assumption that the men were infected by the United States government, which they were not. The study was supposed to be of late latency, even though not all the men were in non-contagious stages. So the key elements of that study, as you know, were the deceptions, the no consenting, the offer of burial assurance, and the use of what I would call a private public health nurse to help them. That the study goes on even after penicillin, even after people begin to raise questions about its ethics, beginning actually in the 50s, and it finally ends with a media outcry in the 70s. This is a photo of Eunice Rivers, the African-American nurse who serves as the go-between the men and the family, handing out a packet of aspirins to one of the men in the study, explaining that it was treatment for his bad blood. This is a photo of a spinal tap during the study in which the men were told that it was a special treatment, not diagnostic. So we know now that not everybody died from the disease. The minimum is probably 12, and it certainly could have been many, many more, and it did cause enormous pain and suffering. Despite the attempt by the Public Health Service to keep everybody from treatment, we know that Tuskegee is not a concentration camp, that some of the men moved other places. There's evidence that some of the men in the area got treated, and we know that 22 wives who were still alive in 1973, 17 children and 2 grandchildren tested positive for the disease. We don't know where they got the disease, but the assumption was made by the CDC that they had been, the disease had come from their fathers, husbands, or grandfathers, and therefore they were given treatment at the time. And Tuskegee is often noted as the reason African Americans don't participate in clinical trials, even though we know there are many other reasons, and I've argued that Tuskegee is more of a metaphor for racism than actual knowledge of the study itself. So this is Jay Katz, but I'm going to play you a clip of a man named John Cutler, who becomes very important in the Guatemala story. This is from a film called The Secret of Bad Blood, which I saw for the first time in 1994 here at a program that Joan Klein put together here about Tuskegee. And here is Cutler. It's in the early 90s, so this is 20 years now after the study at Tuskegee has been revealed. And think about if you were involved in the study and it's 20 years later and all of this brouhaha has happened. Here's a chance for you to say, we made a mistake. Here's a chance to think about why we thought about it differently in the bad old days, and da-da-da. Here's Cutler. So let me see if I can go.
We have no compunction about sending our youth away to war when it's in the national interest. And in terms of syphilis, was the leading cause of maternal mortality, leading single cause of admission to mental hospitals, and the other things. So it was in the national interest to get the information so that you could provide the greatest protection for the entire community, black and white.
So that's what we see, and I'm speaking about it. Here he is in a film called Deadly Deception, which PBS put together, came out in 93, and he makes a similar kind of and listen to the first sentence, it's just remarkable.
My regret is, in terms of the study, I have none. As a scientist, and say, one would like to have seen an ideal scientific study, but we're dealing with human beings over a long period of time, and this is impossible.
So given that kind of commentary, many of us who met in the mid-90s pushed, in fact, for an apology. There was a formal apology for Tuskegee in 97, and when the 5 of the 6 remaining men from the study were still alive, they've now all passed. So this is the context for the research I'm doing on Tuskegee, and I'm interested in sort of how the story gets told, and I'm trying to figure out a way to talk about it, not in the melodramatic ways. And one of the things to remember is how much in American film history, so many of these movies are about the sort of melodramatic stories of the scary doctor scientist who will do bad things to you on islands and backyards and things like that. So there's the Cabinet of Dr. Kilgary from the 20s, there's the H.G. Wells' The Island of Lost Souls, and then of course there's Frankenstein. And when I was trying to think about how to think about this, I found this quote from the late film director Sidney Lumet, which I think is terrific, in which he says, especially think of its appeal to a historian, in a well-written drama, he says, the story comes out of the characters. That is, you want to write a story in which the characters create what happens. But in a melodrama, he argues, the characters in a well-written melodrama come out of the story. That is, we already know what the answer is. We already know who the characters, we know there's going to be Dudley Do-Right, we know there's going to be Snotty Whiplash, and we already know what's going to happen. And the problem often, and I think, and the challenge to thinking in ethical terms and historical terms about both Tuskegee and the Guatemala studies are, how do you think about them outside this sort of very melodramatic frame in which you think you already know what happened. So that's been the struggle. That I did this edited book in 2000 of documents on the study, and then I wrote a book that came out in 2009 about the study itself. So in the context of doing that research, of course, one of the rumors that is really enormous is this rumor that the men were inoculated and given the disease in Tuskegee. And in particular, this photo, or this one, which is also a blood draw of Eunice Rivers, but particularly this one, often gets cropped. So you see a white hand on a black arm, and you can't really tell unless, you can tell that it's a blood draw, his fingers pulling back on the but most people can't, on the syringe, but most people can't. And so this image gets used, and I'll show you in a second how it gets used about this story. So in 2003, I am in this completely nondescript building in an industrial section of Pittsburgh. Thank God for Google, I found it. As you can tell, it's point A. It's in the middle of nowhere, and I've gone there to work in the Thomas Perrin Papers because Perrin was the Surgeon General when Tuskegee starts. And the archivist, bless her soul, says to me, you know, there's John Cutler papers here. Now remember, this is 10 years after I've been here, and I've got Cutler, those images of Cutler burned into my brain, and I say, oh God, maybe there's Tuskegee stuff that I don't know about. And I open these boxes, and all there is this stuff about Guatemala. And it says, inoculation study. And you have to understand, again, I'm now 20 years of my life saying, oh no one was inoculated in Tuskegee, right? And there's Cutler, and he's in Guatemala, right? And I just can't believe it. And, it's just stunning. But if you read, and there are thousands of medical records, and there are photographs, because his wife, Elise Cutler, took photographs, and there are pictures of all the inoculating going on. And I don't know what to do with this stuff, and I'm not a biostatistician, and I look at all this data, and I've just finished, I'm about to code the Tuskegee men's data, and I just think, I can't do this. I can't do this. So I just look at the correspondence, primarily in Cutler's report. And I think, okay, this will work into the book, and then of course, the book is 100 pages too long, and it doesn't fit, and so I take it out. And then I look at these notes after the book goes to press, and I think, whoa, this looks really bad. I think maybe I think about this again. So I go back to Pittsburgh in 2009, and I look at the stuff more carefully. And I write it up. And so let me tell you a little bit about it, and then how it becomes a huge story, and not just some little historian story. So I'll go through these briefly, because Marcia's given you the key ideas. The concern, of course, in the late 40s is penicillin in 43 proves a cure for early syphilis, but they don't know. It's a new drug. There isn't even much of it. They're actually recycling it through urine. They're using it back again. There isn't much. And they're interested in the question of prophylaxis. That is, they know, particularly in the armies, that men will go out, they will have sex with people who will probably infect them. And they want to know if there's something that can be used other than these pro kits, which men were given in the army to rub on their penises, and they burned. And as you can imagine, there wasn't a whole lot of compliance. So if you want to know what historians do in their spare time, by the way, you can buy these on eBay, which is where I got mine. A few people on the planet type syphilis into eBay, not a Scottish suit or something. So this question is out there, right, about what does this do? Is it going to work? What happens? So there had been a study on the use of penicillin as a prophylaxis in gonorrhea that had been done, previously in Terre Haute at the federal penitentiary, but there was consenting, although I would argue still in some disagreement here with the Presidential Commission that getting consent in the situation where you're giving people money to go buy more things at their commissary in the prison and giving them cigarettes and writing a nice letter to their parole board raises an issue about what's consent or not. But the study doesn't work very well, and they close it down relatively quickly. So in 1946, the study in Guatemala begins, and it's a grant to the National Institutes of Health under the Public Health Service. It's given to what's called PAHO now, the Pan American Sanitary Bureau. Cutler is the senior surgeon in the U.S. Public Health Service who runs it, and his contact in Guatemala, and the person that he speaks to, and I suspect that he and Funes worked this out together, is the director of what's then called the VD division in Guatemala, and Funes is on loan to the VDRL, the VD Research Lab here in the United States. And my theory is that honestly Cutler and Funes go out for a beer. And they start chatting, and he explains Terre Haute, and Funes says, oh, you should come to Guatemala and do the study there. And so the study gets approved by this study section of very senior people within the syphilis community. And this is what Cutler, remember what he looked like as an older man? This is what Cutler looked like in 1946 when he goes off to Guatemala. But this picture, I think, is really interesting. This is Cutler as a young man. With his family. He's the oldest. It's his sister Elizabeth and the two younger boys. Here's what I found out since I did the work in Guatemala. Both of his brothers were in the Army Air Force, and both of his brothers were killed in the war. So in 1946, when Cutler says, when he goes off to Guatemala, but in the 90s, when he says, we were at war with syphilis, and in a war people die, he's speaking in part, I'm not trying to be his analyst, but I think it's really interesting to imagine that he understood what it meant to sacrifice. He had lost both of his brothers to the war. So the purpose of this study was to look at methods of prophylaxis, in particular to understand penicillin. Again, remember, it's 3 years out, it's a new drug, they don't know. There are lots of questions about serologies in particular, and they're trying to understand more about syphilis. So the question, of course, that always gets raised is why Guatemala? So if you think about it, it's a sexually transmitted disease. You need a contained population to be able to follow it. There's this connection between the Public Health Service and PAHO. In fact, the Surgeon General's up till the 30s, so from the teens to the 30s. The director of PAHO is the U.S. Surgeon General. So there's all of that connection with Guatemala, and you have a vector. I'm using this in terms. That is, not only is prostitution legal in Guatemala, it is legal to bring a sex worker into the prison. So now you've got a contained population and a delivery system for this disease. So what's interesting here is that it's not uncommon, of course, in sexually transmitted diseases to use sex workers. And this is, I thought, was really interesting. In the 1930s, 2 physicians not connected to the Public Health Service were doing some research on a prophylactic jelly that they thought would, it was a contraceptive jelly, but they also thought it would work as a prophylaxis for STDs. So they found it took place in Oklahoma. They found a couple of sex workers. They locked these 2 guys up with them, and the sex workers had gonorrhea, and they tried to figure out whether this would work. And the story got written up by Paul DeCreve, who's a famous science writer, in a journal called Ken. And in the correspondence, in parents' correspondence, Joseph Earl Moore from Hopkins writes to Parent about this, and when he hears about it, he says, "If even I, a physician interested in the venereal disease game, shudder with horror at this particular type of human experimentation, what will be the attitude of the rest of the medical profession of the laity? If their attitude is as condemnatory as I suspected it probably will be, is it not possible that episodes such as this might seriously injure the entire control program of the Public Health Service?" So this is 10 years before they even go to Guatemala. There is a conversation going on about the need, if you're going to do this kind of work, to keep it secret. And Cutler is very clear in this report. Now, understand the thing about Guatemala is that it never gets written up. There are some reports on the serology that get published in Spanish, but there's nothing in the English language on the study. And in the 1953, when they do a similar kind of study, slightly differently with lots of control and informed consent at Sing Sing, they do a 50-page article and published in Medicine. They explain the history of inoculation syphilis. Guatemala is never mentioned, and Cutler is one of the authors on the article. So there's a real attempt to have this not spoken about. So Cutler, in this report that never got published, but it is in his papers, talks about using the prostitutes and how we're going to send them to the prison. So your U.S. taxpayer dollars pays for this research in 1946. They ply the people with alcohol, they time how many times they have sex. It's really, the details were unbelievable. And they're having trouble even then, because one of the ways to see if whether or not people have gotten infected, of course, is to keep doing blood draws, and the prisoners are not very happy about the blood draws and think that even if they get iron tablets, this is not much help to them, so they basically aren't being very cooperative. So they move on, they start doing some blood testing at a national orphanage. They do not infect anybody at the orphanage. I think that's really important to say. But they start looking at blood testing questions, and then the study's being sort of, they're picking up and doing different things as it goes along. So then they decide to move to the National Mental Health Hospital and to the Army, and here they decide to make a decision, because they can't use the prostitutes, to actually make an inoculum. So they get the bacteria either from rabbits that are being sent from the United States that carry the disease, or from a local street strain, or they can transfer it between people, and they make an inoculum and they start infecting. So this is one of the example of a trilogy of photographs of 2 women and 1 man in the mental hospital, taken by Mrs. Cutler, of people who became subjects in the study. And Cutler writes that for me, honestly, this is the most chilling sentence in all of it, because it gives you a sense of what it means to be in an under-resourced area. So here is a hospital where a lot of the patients are in the mental hospital actually epileptics, and they don't have enough Dilantin, which was then the drug of choice. And so Cutler writes, we bought them a refrigerator, a motion picture projector that supplied the recreation, and then for me, the hardest part is here, metal cups, plates, and forks. So think about, I kept thinking about $24 in beads for Manhattan. You know, it has that sense of, you know, there's just so little there that they don't have enough plates to give people. So how easy it would be to bribe people essentially into agreeing to this study. And they expose people through sexual intercourse, through skin contact, through direct injections, through scarification and abrasion of the men's penises and the women's cervixes, and then through cisternal punctures. Then this is you can get, and John will talk about, the Presidential Commission report really did what I was not intellectually and scholarly capable of doing, which is to go through all of the very messy reports and get to some of the numbers. And I want to draw your attention actually to this last number here, because what it gives you is the number we think of subjects who were exposed to any STD, and then the number who received some treatment. But one point to point out, which I think is really interesting, only on the last page practically in the appendix of the report does the commission actually tell you that they didn't identify how many people were clinically infected or how many people received adequate treatment. They can't tell, the records are that bad. So the database focuses the number of individuals exposed to rather than infected. So we actually don't know how many of these infections really took. That doesn't make the attempt to do it any worse, but I think it's worth thinking about how complicated this was and what happens on the ground. So this is an example of one of the medical records that I found, so it gives you a sense. So here they scarified the man's penis. They used a Nichols rabbit strain of the disease. They dropped the inoculum on a pledgelet on a little cotton ball thing, and they did it at 8:16 at, I don't need my glasses, 8:39 and 9:05. So that means for an hour and a half somebody held this man's penis and they dripped the thing on it, and then they went in to see whether or not he evinced infection. So obviously the deception was enormous. The officials at the mental hospital were not told what was going on and what was being done. And then all of us have used this sentence where we have this sort of secondhand quote from Perrin, who says, you know, we couldn't do such an experiment in this country. And I remember when I found that, I just thought, oh my God, I can't believe they actually said this. And you know, a more recent scholar on this has suggested that what Perrin really was talking about was the use of prostitutes, which in fact may be what he meant, but you can see the way in which that sentence can be used in multiple kinds of understandings. And then of course the other sentence that all of us have used is R.C. Arnold, who is one of the people who finds the use of penicillin in 43 and is a hero in public health. And he basically says to Cutler in writing, look, I'm really worried about this, and what about the consent? We better wrap this up fast. What happens if somebody really finds out about what we're doing? So you have a sense, and Tuskegee, remember, was done pretty publicly. People were invited to come down there. There were 13 articles published in major journals. This is exactly fits this sort of the mad doctor on the island kind of melodramatic and conspiratorial imagery. So just to remind you what else was being done is that Cutler helped start a VD program at the military and provides a prophylactic plan for the Army. They're treating orphans with both malaria and syphilis, and they treat people who had VD but who had not been exposed to it as part of their research. However, by 1948, the STD division of the Public Health Service is losing money because now everybody thinks you just get penicillin, and so there's less and less money being made available. And Cutler isn't showing much results, so they tell him to close the study down and to come home. And there's some evidence, it continues a bit in terms of the blood testing, but we don't know for sure yet how much longer it goes on. So just to remind you of the difference between the two studies, in Guatemala the subjects, men and women, are given syphilis and other STDs, and some are given penicillin, even though not everybody clearly was cured who became infected. In Alabama, the men already had the disease and were supposed to be in late latency, that is no longer infectious. And the men were supposed to be kept for treatment, but my reading of the medical records suggests that at least the men who survived into the antibiotic era, a number of them were able to escape to treatment. So how does this happen? In 1990, Cutler gives these papers to Pittsburgh. I don't know why. And my jokey theory is his wife got tired of having them in the basement and said, honey, let's just clean up this. I mean, there's thousands of pages, and so, you know, I think they got tired. So I arrived in 2003, I look at this stuff again, I think it's a treatment study, so I don't do anything on it. I returned in 2009. I write it up in the spring of 2010, and I'm about to give it at the annual meeting of the American Association of History of Medicine, and I'm on, for those of you who go to conferences will understand this, I'm on Sunday afternoon, right? And we're in Rochester, Minnesota, where you have to take 2 planes to get home, right? So needless to say, it was a small audience. And, you know, medical historians are a pretty hardened bunch. Most of us didn't freak out about this. We've learned about this kind of stuff before. And I'm going to write it up. I got asked to publish it in a relatively obscure history journal called the Journal of Policy History. But in the interim, and here's what makes it interesting, I had become friends with someone who had started to interview, David Sensor, the former director of the CDC, who plays a very bad role in the Tuskegee story and is the head of CDC when the study ends in '72. And I asked him as my aging syphilologist friend, would you read this to make sure I didn't get the medicine wrong? And Dave says to me, you're worried about the facts? He says, the facts are the least of the problems in this. What happens when this gets public? And I said, Dave, it's going to be in this obscure history journal. No one's going to read it. And he says, oh God, in the age of the internet, and I understand he's 86. He says to me, in the age of the internet, everybody reads everything, right? This is going to get out. And I go, oh God, all right. So he said, do you mind if I give it to CDC? And I say, no, of course not, why not? So he gives it to CDC. They question me, they send John Douglas, one of our leading syphilologists, to Pittsburgh to redo the data, and John's staff is able to actually do some of the numbers, initial numbers, and that's when I really realized deeply that there was no real, that the treating is much more minimal than I thought. So my paper, unpublished still, and John Douglas's report goes up, it goes to NIH, and then it goes up the chain of command. So the next, this is a picture of Dave Sensor toward the end of his life. He died last year. And that's a picture of him from the 70s. For those of you who remember the debacle of the swine flu epidemic in '77, Dave was fired as the director of CDC for pushing for inoculation, for vaccines in '76 and '77. And this is Harold Jaffe on the left, who was the director, the vice chair for science at CDC. The man on the bottom is John Douglas, who did the report. And the man on the top is Zeke Emanuel, who then was sort of the head health policy person for the Obama administration, very concerned about changing rules for IRBs, and so I think understood that this could be used politically to push a set of agendas around these issues, and thought the apology was really, and it's written on exploitation in third world countries. So it got orchestrated so that both Sebelius and Clinton would apologize to the Guatemalans on October 1st, that President Obama would call President Colón, then the President of Guatemala, and express regret. So Colón calls it the crime against humanity, and originally the Institute of Medicine is asked to do research on it, and then they discovered there's too much connection between the early syphilis section and the IOM, so the Bioethics Commission gets to really relook at all of this. And their report, if you just go to bioethics.gov, you can get it, and John will speak about what it's like. This is what the front page looked like in the Guatemalan newspapers the next day. Here's another one. This is one of the cartoons in the Guatemalan papers, which has the U.S. looking in the mirror and seeing Mendele, the Nazi war criminal, staring back. And this is my favorite, actually. It shows Mrs. Clinton apologizing to President Colón, and the Guatemalan person says, what about the Cold War, the paramilitary groups, the demand for drugs, and the hate against immigrants, pointing out that the relationship between Guatemala and the United States has not exactly been a warm and fuzzy one over the last half century. And this is what the front page of the New York Times story looked like. So here is an interesting, this story was a kind of equivalent of 60 Minutes that played in Australia about a year ago. And I happened to be in Tuskegee when it came to interview me, so it links Tuskegee very carefully with Guatemala. But the picture on the left with the arm of the person having the blood draw is actually from Tuskegee, but it says infected. So you can see how visually, and then of course I'm standing in the graveyard. That's where we filmed. We filmed in the graveyard of the men in Tuskegee. So all of it gets visually linked together. So the public, the government was really good about this, I think. It really was encouraging. They put all of this stuff up on a website almost immediately. Then there's the 2 reports, and John's going to speak about that the commission did. So I just want to summarize at the end here now a little bit about this. At the time, of course, it was not uncommon to use vulnerable populations in the United States. There was a long history of infecting and inoculating in STD research, and there had been, even in the 19th century, uproars. There's something about the use of vulnerable patients with an STD in particular, that always leads to some kind of media coverage. Deception was more normative than we think of. It was seen as important in the doing of science. And the other thing I think, of course, that makes this so powerful is it's the same time that we are prosecuting, of course, the Nazis at Nuremberg in 46 to 48 is going on. This same kind of questions are not being discussed here. So I want to talk a little bit about why this much coverage. I think one of the things to remember, as a friend of mine said, the U.S. doesn't usually apologize to foreigners. So we barely ever, despite claims to the opposite, we don't often apologize to other countries at all. The details clearly are incredibly gruesome and involve sex and close to, obviously, medical torture. The story fits this trope of a grade B horror movie where the intrepid explorer is now this sort of historian and the seeming single doctor becomes the monster. I can't tell you how many times press people have asked me, so how did you feel when you found the material? Like, who cares what I felt? Do you know what I mean? It was just so interesting to me about what made the story possible. There is, of course, underlying mistrust about medical research, especially when it's combined with the power of the state. And of course, now that we do so much of our testing overseas, what it really hit a particular button at a moment when we're starting to have more debate about these issues. So in the last year, we've gotten the Bioethical Commission's reports. The Guatemalan government has a report that CDC is actually now translating into English. All of Cutler's papers, including the ones that I worked on, are now, Pitt was only too happy to give this back to the government, as you can well imagine. So they're which is the good news, actually. So they're in the National Archives, and you can go look at everything that I looked at. If you just Google Cutler papers in National Archives, you'll get there. And the debate over subject protection has continued. Needless to say, the first people who called me were not only the press, but tort attorneys. So, of course, there's an international lawsuit that was filed, and the firm called it the Guatemalan Tuskegee. The U.S. fought to dismiss the suit. It was dismissed this past June, actually, although I understand that the law firm is now appealing. There's been some money given to Guatemala for STD work, and there's a debate going on about compensation to individuals who can be found to be either been in the study or have been relatives that were harmed. So I have some final thoughts about this coverage. I think one of the things that's really important is that Cutler and his colleagues really thought they were doing good science. I think it's really dangerous for us to think about this as only the bad old days, or to use the term bad science, even though a lot of the research was terrible. I think it's really important to remember that they thought what they were doing was right, because otherwise it's just too easy to put this away. I think there's a problem, and John and I can talk about this, when we pick up the most egregious cases. So in the report from the commission, there are several case studies. They have little boxes, and one of them is a case study. I remember John spoke about it directly himself when the commission reported out about a woman named Bertha, and it's an awful story about this woman dying, and they're still continuing to infect her with gonorrhea. But there's also the story of Carlos, who had the disease ahead of time and who they treat, and nobody picks up Carlos. Of course, it's like, if it bleeds, it leads kind of way of thinking about this. So none of this sort of, I'm not suggesting that Carlos makes a difference for what happened to Bertha, but I think it's interesting to think about what gets picked up and what doesn't. My biggest concern, frankly, is that what happens is that Cutler will be seen as an aberrant, sort of lone gunman monster, and I think that the commission did a good job of trying to put it in the context of who approved it, but I think it's too easy, as you can see from the use of these clips, even in the way I presented it, for us to blame him individually. And I feel like my task, and I've written elsewhere about him, is to not make you imagine that you couldn't be him, but to make you think about how you could be him, because that's what's much more important, and I think that's hard. I think we have to think really hard about what it means for people in under-resourced countries when these kind of requests get made, because you can understand why the Guatemalan government agreed to it and what they thought they would get from it. It helped build up their infrastructure. It was a trade-off that I think they thought was important, and it fits, as their report says briefly, that racism also, of course, in Guatemala, where most of the recruits in the army and in the prison are Mayan Indians rather than Latinos, and so there's the whole internal racism of Guatemala. itself. And then it raises, of course, this question about human subject protection as we go forward. What do we owe to people in other countries? What does informed consent look like? How do we help train researchers to internalize a sense of what's right and wrong here as we go forward? So I close with, for those of you who watch TV, they redid this movie called Coma. Some of you may have watched it. It was over Labor Day weekend. And it's not really a research trial. It's actually where they put people into comas and then harvest and they updated it so that there's genetic material they're taking as well as organs from the earlier version. But in the end of it, Richard Dreyfuss character says to Lauren Ambrose, who's the sweet doctor here, and he says, well, it's human sacrifice, but we have to do that for science. And she says, what about individual rights? And then the last screen in the picture shows this Dr. Gina Davis, and she's in China. And she says, hi, I'm here in China. And you have this sense as the film ends, of course, that the research has now been offshored from Atlanta, which is where they show it. So I thought that the hint is that CDC, even though they're not saying it, off to China. And I think it leaves us with a sense, just like the Grey's Anatomy, how much this is still being covered and is of enormous American concern. Thank you.
So we all owe a big debt to Susan for bringing this case to light. I've often wondered what it would be like for a philosopher to make an analogous discovery. You're in the Pittsburgh archive and you come across this cardboard box, and inside the box it says, "We are metaphysically free." Personal identity does subsist over time, and all the arguments for God's existence are bad. It would be nice. I'm going to talk. I'm not going to give you an overview of what the commission talked about and did. I'm going to, and you can just go to the bioethics.gov website to get the entire report, okay? I'm going to focus on one of the latter sections of the report, though, in which we do talk about this question of culpability, all right? Or the problem of retrospective moral judgment. So whenever a historian is involved in a case like this, we have to think about this issue, because this is something that happened a long time ago. Maybe different ethical norms were in place at the time. And so how are we to come to grips with that behavior and those characters, right? What are we to think of them? So there are different objects of moral judgment. For example, we can talk about the institutions or the practices of institutions. And I think, as Susan was hinting there at the end, we can and should do that with regard to Guatemala, because this was a study that was approved all the way up the line. The Surgeon General approved this study. So again, the last thing I want to do is to turn John Cutler into some kind of rogue monster acting on his own. Secondly, we can talk about the rightness or wrongness of actions. Okay, what was the act itself wrong? Okay. And thirdly, and this is what I really want to talk about, there's the question of blameworthiness. Over and above the question of whether an act was wrong, there's the more complicated question of whether somebody is culpable or blameworthy for having done it. So this brings up all kinds of what the lawyers call mens rea type issues. What's in the mental state of the person? How much did they know about the operative norms? How much should they have known? Were they ignorant of basic facts or norms? Was that ignorance culpable ignorance, right? Or whether, or maybe it was what the medieval theologians called ignorantia supina, which is just, where you're out of it and you can't be blamed for not knowing something. And then finally, we can also possibly cast judgment on the character of individuals. So over and above the question of whether somebody was guilty or blameworthy, there's the question of what this tells us about what kind of person this was. So given the fact that I've got about, I don't know, 5 minutes, I shouldn't have even said that because I've lost another 20 seconds in the process. So I want to talk about the third issue, which is about blameworthiness or culpability. Okay. Now, as Susan hinted, there are really a lot of reasons to be very wary when making judgments of this sort. Very easy to make glib judgments of moral, assuming moral superiority over people from a past age who were moved by different considerations. And also, as Susan pointed out, there were major shifts taking place in the morality of medicine at the time, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then there are these convoluted questions about moral universalism and relativism. To what extent are moral notions solid, universal, enduring, and to what extent are they limited to different eras? So I'm going to focus on blameworthiness and culpability. So I want to talk about two separate issues. First of all is the question about the failure to get informed consent. So, of course, we're outraged about the total failure to get consent in this case, but I'm inclined to think that Cutler and company deserve maybe a little bit of slack with regard to this question. As I mentioned, there was a tremendous shift taking place at the time in the culture of medicine with regard to the issue of consent. Most people regarded ethical constraints or regulatory constraints as just a pain in the neck, and constraints brought in, by others, by non-doctors, to impede scientific progress. Cutler talks about, we don't want, outsiders to hear about this because that'll bring a plague of do-gooders, down here who are going to put an end or at least impede our research. So there was Nuremberg, which put informed consent at the top of the Nuremberg Code. There were glimmers. NIH had a policy of getting consent for purely experimental studies on non-patients. But these are just the beginnings of a new culture that respected autonomy and demanded consent. So I think it's accurate to say that Cutler was swimming in a cultural milieu which was defined by physician discretion. Okay? It was up to physicians to determine how much people were told or whether they were going to be told anything. So with regard to the failure to obtain consent, we might say that this was clearly a wrong action in terms of our own morality, which prizes individual autonomy and liberty, but that the researchers at the time may not be blamable, or if they are, some charitable observers might plead mitigating circumstances on their behalf. Still, though, I think it's very noteworthy and perhaps even damning that the researchers' actions, policies, and words during the Terre Haute study that Susan mentioned were flatly at odds with the actions, policies, and words of the same researchers in Guatemala. At Terre Haute, that we can discuss the issue of incentives and inducement and coercion and so forth. But at Terre Haute, these same people were saying, you've got to get consent, and the consent has to be informed, and these people have to be real volunteers, right? So that's what they were saying in 1943. So they go to Guatemala, and they're no longer saying that. They're just doing this study without any consent. So they're, really, the commission's judgment was, and I had to be dragged kicking and screaming into this consensus, the commission's judgment was that they really sort of convict themselves on this point. I mean, their own words belie their actions. Second major issue I want to talk about very briefly is the question of exposing people to these sorts of harms and risks, as was done in this study. Susan mentioned the case of Berta. This may be, an outlier of a case, but I think it's worth quoting at somewhat greater length. So Berta was injected in her left arm with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies. Several weeks later, Cutler noted that she had also developed red bumps. So soon after, on August 23rd, Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die. But he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of her eyes, as well as in her urethra and rectum. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, her eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea, and she was bleeding from her urethra. And then a couple of days later, she died. Now, I think, again, this may not be totally representative, and there may be a lot of good things they also did, but I would argue that there is absolutely no way of finessing this kind of behavior. No way we can finesse this by invoking some sort of historical relativism. I would argue that this kind of behavior flatly contradicts the Hippocratic Oath. This is an action that, the Hippocratic Oath says basically, I will not harm or do injustice to my patients. And if this doesn't do harm and injustice to people, I don't know what does. So in this kind of a case, then, we have both Cutler and company's own words at Terre Haute, and we have evidence from what I would call the internal morality of medicine. We don't need to import disputable or contested notions of universal morality that might be imposed on these people. This was a morality that physicians had lived with for millennia. So, in my view, this is just torture, okay, and not very different from what the Nazis were doing. So the commission closes its report here with a couple of lessons learned. One is that researchers must never take ethics for granted, let alone confuse ethical principles with burdensome obstacles to be overcome or evaded. Sadly, I think we can say that a lot, or at least some, of the required ethics training and regulation of research in this country may actually encourage such attitudes. And a big challenge for us, I think, is to make ethics training, to really get at it from the inside as a real ethical quest rather than as something imposed from the outside. Second major take-home point from the commission: we must be ever vigilant to ensure that such reprehensible exploitation of our fellow human beings is never repeated. And to that I say amen. Thank you.
A very rich and interesting presentation. We have a little bit of time now for your questions and comments. And please identify yourself when you speak.
Michael Ryan from the Division of Infectious Diseases. Do not misunderstand me. I am not supporting Nuremberg, Tuskegee, Guatemala. What should be the reception to any actual, and I realize it was bad science, but what should be the reception to any data that may have been generated in these studies, if it can be used? Should it be? I guess my question is...
There we go. Dr. Ryan's everybody's raised this question about what do you do with the data, and that's been raised on the Nazi data as well, and so there are differing positions on this issue of if the data is gotten in these unethical ways, should we not use it? And one thing to understand with both the Tuskegee data and certainly with the Guatemala data is the data is so bad that you really can't learn. I mean, the Tuskegee case, they literally moved, for those of you who do research, you'll love this, they moved people who got syphilis, who were in the control arm, into the syphilitic arm of the study. And when I was looking at medical records, there were also clearly people who were in the syphilitic arm who actually never really had the disease. They were misdiagnosed. They, of course, don't get moved into the control arm. So the data is, and so I think one of the things to say is I don't think there's any science. I think it has to be decided on a case-by-case basis for me, and in both of these cases, what's learned is the issue about how we do science and ethics together, not the science itself separately. We can't be there.
Good question. I agree with Susan that a lot of this data is garbage, okay? My favorite anecdote about Tuskegee from James Jones's book is when some hotshot came, an epidemiologist came down from Washington to review the study. He blasted the methodology on the grounds that here was Nurse Rivers giving people partial treatment, right? So it was supposed to be a study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, right? It wasn't that. And so he, blasts them and he says, you just got to throw all these people off the study. And they looked around the room at each other, and this was really it must have been an amazing moment, okay? Because they looked at each other and said, well, what would we tell the people? We're kicking you off the study because you were treated, okay? So big problems with the data, but yeah, there are some cases. The Nazi hypothermia studies were an object of major study and concern in this country. I guess my own seat of the pants judgment here is that some of this data may, if it really is unique and can never be repeated, and is maybe useful in saving lives, I would argue, along with a lot of my Jewish friends. I worked at Einstein for 15 years, so I'm an honorary Jew. Okay? I would argue with a lot of my Jewish friends that you should use the data, but at the same time, you have to indicate somewhere up front in the article that the data were gained illicitly and unethically.
My concern isn't even the data or the methodology. My concern starts with the hypothesis. It starts with the sense of inequality that subserves the generation of that research question itself. We saw at the level of metonymy, which is on equal exchange. We're at the level of metonymy where things are equal to people. And that's the problem. Not people equal to people as a metaphor. And who are you here? Oh, who am I? Morris
It's like
Alfred.
Jeopardy, could you ask that?
Morris Alfred.
I want to say one other thing about something, John, I agree with you completely, and one of the things that John said is interesting when he said the failure of the Hippocratic Oath, but I think it's interesting to think about whether or not Cutler ever saw them as patients. So the interesting division is, are they subjects? And if you are subjects, are the rules different than for patients? So one of the things that's interesting, the Tuskegee data, I actually wrote about this in my book, the language slips a lot. So they use the word patient a lot in the Tuskegee material, but not in Cutler. Right up of Guatemala's, they're always subjects. So I think it's interesting to think intellectually about if you make that differentiation, then you have different sets of rights. And the other thing I wanted to say, I tell audiences this, when my dad was mostly an internist and did private practice, but he did research on penicillin in the late 40s on heart disease, and he was doing a study on bacterial endocarditis in Chicago. And in 1946, actually, ironically. And so I said, so what kind of informed consent did you do? And he said to me, I told the patients if they didn't try this new drug, they'd die. And he was honest. At that point, bacterial endocarditis was a death sentence. So, but that's what, I think of that as passing for a kind of informed consent that went on verbally at that point in time.
So this is perhaps more of a comment than a question, but I think the notion of compensation for research injury is certainly something that's inherent in both of these cases, and that we still struggle with, and that that I would hope we would learn from in terms of the retrospective scope, because I find in my work with data and safety monitoring boards and IRBs and looking at studies that this is not something that I think has been sufficiently addressed within the research community, and it's, I think there's a huge moral problem there.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Faith. I see
And
a
that
couple
is Mary Faith Marshall, who's our new
Yeah,
clinical
yeah,
ethicist here.
an official welcome back to UVA. I see two routes of compensation here. One of them is the official apology, coupled with, I believe, financial contributions. I mean, so I think there has been some action along that front, providing money and facilities for research on these kinds of issues. That's important. But the other angle for compensation is the lawsuit that Susan was talking about. And there I'm a bit more conflicted, okay? Just because, part of me is saying, my God, what's the problem here? We've apologized. We document all the abuses. It's clear we've done wrong to these people. But I would add that the Guatemalan government was equally guilty, okay, equally complicit. But this gets me way out of my pay grade in terms of the law, okay? But it's very unclear, which of the plaintiffs or how many of them were actually causally harmed by the study, right? I don't know, so intuitively I'm thinking, well, of course, people should, be able to sue for large amounts of money, for injured family members or whatever. And I don't buy the Justice Department's notion that, oh, well, everybody's, we're no longer dealing with the same heads of these organizations anymore. I think that's a lame argument. But there are real sort of epistemological problems about who did what, where, and who affected who that I think could really muck things up there with regard to a legal case.
And my apologies, but we're out of time.